Thank you for joining us today. Most people know about the 66 books of the Bible, but did you know there are 15 other ancient books that were once included in many Bibles? They're called the Apocrypha, and they've sparked debate, mystery, and controversy for centuries. In this video, we'll uncover what these books are, why they were removed from many modern Bibles, and whether they hold any spiritual or historical value today. Are they lost truth or false teachings? You might be surprised by what you learn. So let's dive into the hidden world of the Apocrypha. Before we continue, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. In Greek, Apocrypha means hidden or secret, while Biblia translates to books or scrolls, and when combined is understood to mean hidden books. It's a term that has been used variously from time to time and by different groups and individuals. Some ancient writers applied it to books of esoteric or otherwise mysterious wisdom, which were too complicated for the ordinary man and which could be understood only by the initiated. Hence they were secret books, hidden from the general reading public. Others used the term in the disparaging sense of false, spurious, heretical, and extra-canonical, therefore hidden or withdrawn from circulation. Even in ecclesiastical circles there has been and is a variety of usage. Some in these circles use it to apply to all religious literature of ancient times that is outside the canon of Holy Scripture. Among Protestants, it is generally used to specify those books that were included in copies of the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, but which were excluded from the Hebrew canon of scriptures. Catholics designate at least 12 of these books as deuterocanonical and use Apocrypha to apply to other extra-canonical literature, which Protestants have come to call pseudepigrapha, meaning falsely entitled. Apocrypha is here used, as in the Reformed churches, to designate the 15 documents found in some Greek and Latin manuscripts of the Old Testament, but which were not included in the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures. These apocryphal books were produced for the most part during the last 2 centuries, B.C., though one or two probably came from the 1st century AD. These books have been variously classified chronologically by language, by literary type, and by place of origin. They represent a great variety of literary forms, including history, romance, poetry, apocalypse, wisdom, and devotion. Our review will be based on the order in which they appear in the Revised Standard Version of the Apocrypha, published in 1957. First is the first book of Esdras, sometimes called the Greek Esdras, and third Esdras in the Latin Vulgate, where Ezra and Nehemiah are called first and second Esdras, respectively. It was composed originally, probably in Hebrew, in the early 2nd century BC. By the middle of that century, it was probably translated into Greek by an Egyptian Jew. This historical book gives an independent account of the general period covered by portions of 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, beginning with the celebration of the Passover in the reign of Josiah, which was 621 BC, and extending to the reading of the law by Ezra, the scribe, in 444 BC. Yet it is frequently inconsistent with the canonical sources and with itself as well. Hence, it is often described as historical fiction. Neither Catholics nor Protestants accept it as the canonical. It is best known for its account of a trial of wits among 3 young bodyguards of King Darius I, who sought the best answer to the question, "What is the strongest thing in the world?" The first affirmed, "Wine is strongest." The second said, "The king is strongest," but the third, who is supposed to have been Zerubbabel, declared, "Women are strongest, but truth is victor over all things." At the answer of the third, the people applauded and cried, "Great is truth and strongest of all." The narrative describes this event as furnishing the opportunity for Zerubbabel to obtain from Darius the command to resume the building of the temple in Jerusalem. Second is the second book of Esdras, an apocalyptic work also known as fourth Esdras, or even third Esdras, when, as in the Greek, Ezra and Nehemiah are reckoned as one book. It has had a complicated literary history. The Oriental versions in which it has come down to us, Syriac, Ethiopic, Armenian, Georgian, and 2 Arabic, recognize only chapters 3 to 14. These chapters comprise probably the original Jewish work, composed about the end of the 1st century AD. Only the Latin versions contain the preface, chapters 1 and 2, and the conclusion, chapters 15 and 16, and are believed by scholars today to be of Christian origin, probably from the 2nd and 3rd century AD, respectively. Chapter 1, verse 30, for example, clearly appears to be borrowed from Matthew 23, verse 37, and chapter 1, verse 37 is to be compared with John 20, verse 29. The concept of the rejection of the Jews as God's people and the calling of the Gentiles definitely reflects a Christian viewpoint. Chapters 1, verses 24, 25, 35 to 40, and so on. Chapters 3 to 14 consist of the alleged apocalypse of Salatiel, who is identified with Ezra. It is believed that this part of the book was written probably in Hebrew, that it dates from sometime near the end of the 1st century AD, and that it was named Esdras or Ezra to commend it to the rabbinic Judaism of that period. The Apocalypse is composed of 7 visions that attempt to unveil the future and to answer certain aspects of the problem of God's dealings with his people. The writer uses an involved symbolism, especially in the visions of the mourning woman, chapter 9, verse 26 to chapter 10, verse 59, the eagle with 3 heads, 12 wings, and 8 smaller wings, chapters 11, verse 1 to 12, verse 39, and the man rising from the sea, chapter 13, verses 1 to 56. Chapter 14 has the fictitious account of the restoration of the sacred books which Nebuchadnezzar is said to have burned, and of Ezra's dictating to 5 secretaries the contents of 24 Old Testament books and 70 apocalypses. In the Oriental versions, the story culminates in the Assumption of Ezra. The unusual numbering in chapter 7, in the Revised Standard Version, is to be explained on the basis of a further complication in the book's history. A section of some 70 verses was left out in most Latin manuscripts, probably for dogmatic reasons, since it contained an emphatic denial of the value of prayers for the dead, verse 105. The lost section was recovered in a Latin manuscript and is now inserted after verse 35 as verses 36 to 105. The rest of the chapter contains a double enumeration in the Revised Standard Version, the Old as found in the King James Version, and an additional one from verse 106 to 140. Second Esdras is not accepted as canonical by either Catholics or Protestants. The third is Tobit. This is a piece of pious fiction, written possibly in Aramaic by a diaspora Jew around 200 BC. It is, well, an adventure story built around Tobit, a supposed Jewish captive in Assyria, and his son Tobias, written with the object of setting forth elevated principles of morality. Although Tobit was a devout man who helped the poor, he suffered reproach from his countrymen and was stricken with blindness, as described in chapters 1 and 2. A quarrel with his wife so discouraged him that he prayed that he might die. At the same time, at Ecbatana in Media, a virgin widow named Sarah, who had married 7 husbands successively, each of whom had been slain on the wedding night by a demon named Asmodeus, prayed that she too might die or be given respite from reproach and false accusations. The prayer of both was heard, and the angel Raphael was sent to bring relief, as told in chapter 3. Pretending to be a man named Azariah, Raphael became Tobias's guide to take him to Media to secure 10 talents of silver left there by Tobit, which is found in chapters 4 and 5. Arriving at the Tigris River, Tobias, at Raphael's direction, caught a huge fish, as we see in chapter 6, the entrails of which proved effective later in banishing the demon Asmodeus and in curing Tobit's blindness. the journey was successful. Tobias acquired the money and married Sarah, who, according to the angel, was destined for him from eternity, as described in chapters 7 to 9. The return to Nineveh was a joyful event for the entire family and for the inhabitants of Nineveh. Tobit was cured of his blindness and welcomed his daughter-in-law, offering praise and blessing to God, as detailed in chapters 10 to 14. The fourth is Judith, a thrilling religious romance deriving its name from a devout, wealthy and beautiful Jewish widow heroine. It was originally written in Hebrew around 150 BC. The Assyrian king Nebuchadnezzar, who is said to have ruled from Nineveh, defeated Arphaxad, king of the Medes, in Ecbatana. He then sent his commander-in-chief, Holofernes, to punish the nations to the west, including the Jews who had refused to assist him in his conquest of the Medes. The only people in the west who dared defy him were the Jews, who, according to the book, had but recently returned from captivity. Holofernes besieged the city of Bethulia. Through her enticement, trickery and bravery, Judith rescued her people by cutting off the head of Holofernes with his own sword while he slept in a drunken stupor. The fifth is the additions to the book of Esther. 6 passages totaling 105 verses interpolated in the canonical book of Esther in Greek at various places during the 1st century BC by pious Jews of Egypt. Since the canonical book of Esther does not contain the name of God, it is thought that the motive for the additions was the desire to supply this name, but these additions have introduced discrepancies and contradictions into the account. The 6th is the Wisdom of Solomon, a religio-political treatise combining Old Testament theological concepts with Alexandrian philosophical ideas derived from Platonism and Stoicism. It was composed in Greek during the 1st century BC, probably at Alexandria. The author, purporting to be Solomon, explains how, after he was divinely chosen as king, as noted in chapter 9, verse 7, he was endowed with wisdom in answer to prayer, as found in chapter 7, verses 7 to 14. The book encourages the Jews to uphold wisdom and righteousness and shows the folly of heathenism. The second half of the book is a religio-philosophical sketch of the history of Pentateuchal times. It attributes the preservation of God's servants from Adam to Moses and onward to wisdom as described in chapters 10 and 11, and shows the folly of idolatry in chapters 13 to 15. The histories of Israel and Egypt are a special demonstration of the results of wisdom on the one hand and of folly on the other, as seen in chapters 16 to 19. The 7th is the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus. Now, this is a book of wisdom, and actually it's the longest and the most highly esteemed of all the apocryphal books. Its alternative name, Ecclesiasticus, meaning churchly book, is usually taken to mean that it was of a quality suitable for reading in the church and for the instruction of catechumens. Interestingly, this is the only apocryphal work of which the author can be identified. Jesus, the son of Sirach, was evidently a teacher, and, it has been suggested that his book contains many of his classroom lectures, as referenced by Pfeiffer in the History of New Testament Times. It was written originally in Hebrew around 180 BC, and then translated into Greek around 132 BC by the author's grandson. Sizable portions of Ecclesiasticus in the original Hebrew have come to light in the Cairo Geniza and from the excavations at Masada. These, especially the latter, which originated in the 1st century AD, allow us to gain a good insight into the degree of dependability of Greek translations of early Hebrew literature. The book sets forth the nature of true wisdom in its application to practical life and human conduct. It's patterned after such wisdom books as Proverbs and contains instruction on morality and practical godliness. The subject matter isn't set forth systematically, but rather it covers a variety of aspects of life. Things like filial and marital duties, friendship, correctness of speech, self-control, hypocrisy, slander, table conduct, rules of etiquette, almsgiving, and mourning for the dead. In spite of the length of the work, the writer affirms, "I have yet more to say, which I have thought upon, and I am filled like the moon at the full." Chapter 39, verse 12. One of its most famous sections is its recital of the stories of the heroes of old, chapters 44 to 50, beginning with the familiar words, "Let us now praise famous men." The eighth is Baruch. This book is patterned after the prophetic writings of the Old Testament and was purportedly written by Baruch, the friend and secretary of Jeremiah, during the Babylonian exile. Many scholars regard it as a composite work, written originally in Hebrew by two or more writers. In its final Greek form, the book is believed by many to have been published in the 1st century AD, with the object of interpreting the terrible calamity that befell the Jews in AD 70. The prose section, possibly originally written in Hebrew, depicts the Hebrew exiles as being so profoundly affected by the message read to them that they repented of their sins and sent a sum of money to Jerusalem to be used for offerings on the altar of God. The prayer of confession and the plea for divine mercy that follows is placed in the mouth of all Israel. Israel has forsaken God, the fountain of wisdom. Hence, the calamities of the exile have come. The final section promises restoration to Israel and predicts the humbling of her oppressors. The 9th is the letter of Jeremiah. This is not a letter at all, nor was it written by Jeremiah. It is a fervent dissertation based on Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 11, urging the Jews to cling to the God of their fathers and not to become fascinated with the idols of the lands of their captivity, which are but insensible metal and wood. Although the Latin Vulgate and other versions, ancient and modern, attach it to the Apocryphal book of Baruch as chapter 6, it is an independent composition and is printed as a separate book in the RSV, which in this follows manuscripts of the LXX. It was written probably between the 4th and 2nd century BC, and probably in Greek, although a Hebrew or Aramaic original composition cannot be ruled out, especially if one considers the book to be a 4th or 3rd century BC composition. The 10th is the prayer of Azariah and the song of the three young men. This is the first of 3 unauthentic additions to the book of Daniel and is inserted between verses 23 and 24 of chapter 3. It was composed probably in Hebrew about the 1st century BC. It professes to record the prayer of Azariah, also known as Abednego, one of the 3 Hebrew worthies, while he and his companions are walking in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. The angel of the Lord then miraculously changes the terrific flames of the superheated furnace into a moist whistling wind. The 3 Hebrews are then pictured as joining in a hymn of praise for deliverance that is reminiscent of Psalm 148. The 11th is Susanna. In the Vulgate, this religious romance follows the last chapter of Daniel and is numbered as chapter 13. It was composed probably in Hebrew about the 1st century BC. Susanna, the beautiful and pious wife of Joachim, a prominent Babylonian Jew, was unlawfully approached by 2 Jewish elders who had been appointed as judges. When she resisted their lustful suggestions, they falsely accused her of committing adultery, and as a result, she was convicted and sentenced to death. She was saved by Daniel, who cross-examined the accusers separately and thereby proved their testimony to be contradictory and thus false and malicious. The 12th is Bel and the Dragon. These are 2 stories written probably in Hebrew during the 1st century BC. In the Vulgate, they appear as chapter 14 of Daniel. The first story is, like Susanna, one of the world's oldest detective stories. In a contest with Babylonian priests regarding Bel or Marduk, Daniel, by sprinkling ashes on the floor, demonstrated that it was not this heathen idol that was devouring food placed in his temple, but the 70 priests with their families who entered the temple by a secret door. The second story tells how Daniel killed a great dragon who was an object of worship by feeding him a concoction of pitch, fat, and hair boiled together. Then Daniel was cast into the lion's den, where he remained 6 days, but was miraculously fed by Habakkuk the prophet, who was transported by an angel from Judea to Babylon. The 13th is the prayer of Manasseh, the prayer purported to be uttered by Manasseh while in Assyrian captivity. It was written possibly in Hebrew around 100 to 50 BC. According to the biblical account, Manasseh became one of Judah's most wicked kings, as we see in 2 Kings chapter 21 verses 1 to 18 and so on. However, when one of the Assyrian kings, probably either Esarhaddon or Ashurbanipal, took him captive to Babylon, he came to his senses and, besought the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, as we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 verse 12. This prayer, which led to his restoration to Judah and his throne, is said to have been recorded in the Book of the Kings of Israel, that's verse 18. The apocryphal prayer of Manasseh purports to be this missing entreaty. Its 15 verses emanate a spirit of sincere penitence and deep religious feeling, although honestly they certainly are not the actual prayer of Judah's king and are not considered to be of canonical status even by Catholics. The 14th is the first book of the Maccabees. This is a work of historical importance, recording the struggles of the Jews for religious and political liberty in the 2nd century BC. The name of 1st and 2nd Maccabees is derived from Judas Maccabeus, the third son of Mattathias, a priest. The designation Maccabeus is usually derived from the Hebrew Maccabah and interpreted as meaning hammer. The name is thought to imply that he, as no other, caused the enemies of Israel and of God to feel hammer blows, although Zeitlin thinks that the name indicates that Judas was hammer-headed. First Maccabees was written in Hebrew by a Palestinian Jew around 110 BC, and is our best source for the history of the first 40 years of the Maccabean Wars. The purpose for writing the book was probably to provide the Jewish nation with an official history of its royal house, the Hasmonean monarchy. It gives a reasonably dependable account of the period from Antiochus Epiphanes, that's 175 BC, to John Hyrcanus, 135 BC. Its emphasis, however, is chiefly on military activity, and it tends to neglect the social, economic, and religious aspects of the period. After giving an account of the events leading up to the Maccabean rebellion in chapters 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 70, the main part of the book centers about the military exploits of Judas in chapters 3, verse 1 to chapter 9, verse 22, and his brothers Jonathan in chapters 9, verse 23 to 12, verse 53, and Simon in chapters 13, verse 1 to 16, verse 24, who succeeded him in the struggle first for religious and then for political freedom. The 15th is the second book of the Maccabees. This is an independent, divergent, and more elaborate account of the events portrayed in 1st Maccabees, chapters 1 to 7, written from the viewpoint of a moralizing theologian. It was composed by a diaspora Jew in Greek about the 1st century BC. The greater part of the book, which covers the first 15 years of the Maccabean Wars, is generally admitted to be a condensation of the 5-volume historical work of Jason of Cyrene, as found in chapters 2, verses 19 to 32. The Hasidim, known as the pious or the godly ones, zealous devotees of the Torah and legalistic orthodoxy, are described as resisting the forcible Hellenization of the Jews. The book, interestingly, lays stress on the supernatural interpositions of God in behalf of the faithful. The writer's purpose is to show the appearances which came from heaven to those who strove zealously on behalf of Judaism, as stated in chapters 2, verse 21, and thus to give instruction and encouragement to the Jews. The book opens with 2 letters, allegedly from the Jews in Palestine to the Jews in Egypt, describing the rededication of the temple and inviting the Jews in Egypt to join in the celebration of the annual Feast of Lights, as detailed in chapters 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 18. The author then proceeds to recall the history that led to the Maccabean revolt, as outlined in chapters 3 to 7. In the remainder of the book, he portrays the successes of the Maccabean revolt, victories in battles as in chapter 8, the death of Antiochus Epiphanes in chapter 9, the purification and rededication of the temple, and subsequent military victories won for the Jews by Judas Maccabeus as described in chapters 10 to 15. The apocryphal books were included in the first complete English Bible, the Wycliffe Bible of 1382, and in all the English Bibles of the 16th century, as well as in the King James, or so-called authorized, version of 1611. At first, they were interspersed among the various books of the Old Testament. In his German translation, Martin Luther segregated these books and placed them, with the exception of 1st and 2nd Esdras, which were excluded altogether from the German Bible translations, as a separate group at the end of the Old Testament, prefaced by the statement Apocrypha, that is, books which are not held equal to the Holy Scriptures, yet are profitable and good to read. Coverdale's English Bible of 1535 followed Luther in segregating these books, but added 1st and 2nd Esdras to them. The preface to the Geneva Bible said of them, "As books proceeding from godly men, they were received to be read for the advancement and furtherance of the knowledge of history, and for the instruction of godly manners." One of the translators of the King James Version, George Abbot, as Archbishop of Canterbury, issued a decree in 1615 that any printer daring to bind and sell a copy of the English Bible without the Apocrypha would be liable to a whole year's imprisonment. However, doctrinal problems caused the Apocrypha to be excluded more and more from Bibles in following years. Finally, early in the 19th century, the British and Foreign Bible Society decided to deny any support to the publication or circulation of these disputed books. With reference to the relation of these books to the canon of the Old Testament, three main positions have been taken by Christian denominations. Firstly, the Roman Catholic Church has given 12 of these books a full canonical status. The fourth session of the Council of Trent on April 8, 1546, decreed that, with the exception of 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh, the apocryphal books entire and with all their parts are sacred and canonical. An anathema is further pronounced on anyone who knowingly and deliberately rejects them. Though denied canonicity and authority, 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh are included in Latin manuscripts of the Vulgate, and in later printed editions they were placed in an appendix to the Bible. Secondly, the Church of England, the Lutheran and Zurich Reformed churches hold that these books are useful but not canonical. Article 6 of the famous 39 Articles of the Church of England from 1562 states that these books are read for example of life and instruction of manners, but the Church does not use them to establish any doctrine. The Swiss reformer Œcolampadius stated in 1530, "We do not despise Judith, Tobit, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, the last two books of Esdras, the three books of Maccabees, the additions to Daniel, but we do not allow them divine authority with the other." Thirdly, the Calvinistic and other Reformed churches have plainly set forth their position in the Westminster Confession of Faith. 1647. The books, commonly called Apocrypha, not being of divine inspiration, are no part of the canon of Scripture, and therefore are of no authority in the Church of God, nor to be any otherwise approved or made use of than other human writings. The Greek Orthodox Church has never made a decision relative to the canon which has been accepted by all of its communion. The Septuagint, which includes the Apocrypha, is accepted as the authentic text of the Old Testament. The Synod of Jerusalem in 1672 placed the Apocrypha in coordination with the canonical books, while the Synod of Constantinople of the same year took the position that these books are not equal to the canonical, but since they are good and worthy of praise, they are not to be rejected altogether. In actual practice, however, this communion has moved toward an almost complete acceptance of the Apocrypha. Protestants, on the basis of internal and external evidence, deny divine authority for, and thus the canonicity of, the Apocrypha. Their English Bibles generally contain the same books as the Hebrews accepted as inspired scripture. Although the Apocrypha, as well as the canonical books, were produced by Jews, they were not accepted by the Jewish people as a part of the official Hebrew canon. The Jews of the intertestamental period seem in fact to have been aware of the absence of the spiritual gift which alone qualified men to write sacred scripture. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus expressed it thus: "Our history hath been written since Artaxerxes, very particularly, but hath not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there hath not been an exact succession of prophets, as found in Against Apion, Book 1, Section 8. Furthermore, persistent uncertainty regarding the apocryphal books is found throughout the history of the Church. From Jerome, who lived from 340 to 420, to the Reformation, learned fathers and theologians are found who insisted upon the basic differences between the canonical books of the Old Testament and the Apocrypha. Perhaps even more important is the internal character of the books themselves. Actually, they do not add essentially to the story of redemption. They teach doctrines and foster practices that are out of harmony with the accepted books of the canon. The idea of making prayers and offerings for the dead, for example, is taught in 2 Maccabees chapter 12, verses 41 to 45, and Baruch chapter 3, verse 4. There is a tendency in the apocryphal books to magnify the externals of religion. Almsgiving and works, they declare, will atone for sin and bring a reward, as in 2 Esdras chapter 8, verse 33, Tobit chapter 12, verse 9, and Ecclesiasticus chapter 3, verse 14. The book of Tobit presents an admixture of piety, folklore, and magic. The demon Asmodeus is represented as a jealous murderer of a young woman's 7 successive bridegrooms, but is finally exorcised by the burning entrails of a fish, as told in Tobit chapter 6, verses 1 to 8, and chapter 8, verses 1 to 9. A potent medicine derived from the gall of the same fish cures a father's blindness, which had been caused by bird droppings, as found in chapters 2, verses 9 and 10, chapter 6, verse 8, and chapter 11, verses 7 to 15. Judith's language and conduct, characterized by double-dealing and falsehood, are represented as meeting with God's approval and assistance, as in Judith chapter 9, verses 10 and 13, and so forth. The Wisdom of Solomon teaches the Platonic doctrine that man's soul is inherently immortal, and that his body is a mere hindrance to the soul, as in chapter 9, verse 15, a view foreign to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The author has also borrowed Plato's doctrine of the pre-existence of souls, found in chapter 8, verses 19 and 20. In conclusion, although the apocryphal books cannot claim canonicity, they are still of value to the Bible student. They provide knowledge of the 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They help us to understand the social, political, and religious climate of the New Testament. The books of the Maccabees, particularly First Maccabees, trace the struggles of the Jews for political and religious freedom against the tyranny of Greek paganism. They help us to understand the rise of such sects as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They throw light on the growth of institutions and beliefs among the Jews of New Testament times, and thus on the background of the early church. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please subscribe, like, and share.